There's a truck in Pokémon Red and Blue. It sits on a little strip of concrete near the SS Anne in Vermilion City, and you can barely even get to it. No other truck exists anywhere in Kanto. It doesn't do anything. You can't open it, you can't move it, you can't interact with it in any meaningful way at all. It's just there. I have thought about that truck more than any adult should, and that's sort of the whole point of tonight, because Game Freak have this habit, 30 years of it now, of putting something odd in a game, saying nothing about it, and then walking away whistling. Some of those things have answers, some genuinely don't. A few of them turned out to be complete nonsense that a kid at school made up in 1997. We're going through 12 of them. No particular order, no big finish. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, you haven't missed anything, I promise. Subscribe if this sort of thing is your cup of tea. Otherwise, no housekeeping. Let's start with the truck. So, the truck. To understand why a completely inert lorry sprite became the most famous rumour in gaming history, you have to understand the situation people were in. Mew was not obtainable, not difficult to obtain, not hidden behind some absurd side quest. Just genuinely, structurally, not in the game as far as normal play was concerned. There was no wild encounter, no trade, no legendary standing at the end of a cave. It was number 151 in the Pokédex. And the Pokédex was the entire promise of the game, so there was this glaring hole right at the end of the list that nobody could fill. And here's the bit that still makes me laugh. Mew wasn't supposed to be there at all. Right at the end of development, the team stripped out the debug features they'd been using to test the game. That freed up a small amount of space in the cartridge, somewhere in the region of 300 bytes, which is nothing. That's less data than this sentence, and Shigeki Morimoto, one of the programmers, used it to quietly slot Mew in. He's talked about this openly since in one of Nintendo's Iwata Asks interviews, and the phrasing has always stuck with me. He said what they did would be unthinkable now. And he's right. Modern games go through certification, compliance, day one patches, entire departments of people whose job is making sure nobody sneaks a secret cat into the code at 4 a.m. Back then it was a handful of people in a room, and one of them thought it would be funny. Management didn't know. That's the part I love. The people running the company had no idea Mew was in their game. So when players started reporting that they'd somehow encountered this pink thing, the official position was essentially, no you didn't. Rumours from excitable children. Fan talk. Nothing to see here. Except it wasn't fan talk because Mew genuinely was in there, and there were glitches that could reach it. The most reliable one involved manipulating trainer encounters in a way that let you fight a Pokémon the game hadn't properly prepared for. Nobody at school knew that, obviously. What people knew was that Mew existed and that somebody's cousin had one. Then Japan ran the promotion that made everything worse. Koro Koro Comics, a manga magazine aimed squarely at kids, announced what got called the Legendary Pokémon offer. Send in your details, and if you win, you post your actual cartridge to them, and they'll put a Mew on it and post it back. Something in the region of 78,000 entries came in. 20 winners? 20? Out of 78,000. And the rest of the country now had confirmation that Mew was real, obtainable in principle, and almost certainly not going to happen for them. That's the vacuum, and a vacuum like that gets filled with whatever's lying around. What was lying around was the truck. The rumour had regional variants the way folk songs do. The core of it was always the same. Get to the truck, use strength on it, and something happens. What that something was depended entirely on who was telling you. Some versions had a Pokeball appear underneath, with Mew inside. Some had Mew simply attack you on the spot. My favourite version, which I heard secondhand and have never been able to source properly, was that moving the truck revealed a Team Rocket hideout underneath. None of it was true. The truck does nothing. You can't use strength on it, you can't cut the tyres. The keys from the game corner don't open it. It is a decorative sprite on a decorative bit of dock. But look at how well constructed the myth is. almost by accident. To reach the truck, you need surf. To use surf in that area, you need the SS Anne to still be docked. And the SS Anne leaves permanently at a point in the story before you'd normally have surf. So the truck sits in a spot that, under ordinary play, is unreachable forever, which means the rumour was almost impossible to disprove. You try it, fail to get there, and conclude that you'd done it wrong, not that the whole thing was made up. There were workarounds people found later, like trading in a Pokémon that already knew surf, or deliberately losing a battle on the ship so you'd get kicked back to town without triggering its departure. But by the time anyone was doing that consistently, the story had already been passed around every playground in the country, sort of like how a ghost story survives specifically because nobody can go and check. And then Game Freak did something genuinely lovely with it. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, the Kanto remakes, they let you use strength on the truck. After all those years, it moves. There is something underneath. It's a lava cookie. A lava cookie is a healing item from Hoenn. It cures status conditions. It is, in every meaningful sense, a snack. And I think it might be the funniest thing in the entire franchise, partly because almost nobody talks about it. Everyone knows the Mew rumour. Comparatively few people know that the developers heard it, thought about it for the better part of a decade, and then answered it with a biscuit. There's a version of that response that would have been annoying, a smug little "nice try" text box, or worse, an actual Mew, which would have retroactively validated a lie. A snack is exactly the right register. It acknowledges you, it rewards you for the effort, and it very gently takes the mickey. The thing that gets me about this whole business is how long-lived it's been. That rumour has now been false for something like 3 decades, and it refuses to die. When Pokémon Go added a way to catch Mew, people immediately started photographing their Mew under actual real-world lorries, which is a beautiful bit of collective silliness. More recently, players in Pokopia, which lets you build things, started constructing elaborate underground Mew habitats beneath rusted-out trucks, which is somehow both a joke and a genuinely sweet tribute. Nobody's confused. Everyone knows it isn't real. They just like it. And I think that's why I wanted to start here, rather than with something spookier. The truck isn't a mystery in the sense of an unanswered question. It was answered fairly quickly, and definitively answered again with a cookie. What it is proof that these games were pretty much built to be talked about. The information was scarce, the world felt bigger than the cartridge could possibly hold, and so a generation of children collectively wrote fan fiction about a parked vehicle and passed it around by word of mouth like it was scripture. One small footnote while we're still on Kanto, because I find it quietly funny. Mew being snuck in at the last minute wasn't just a bit of mischief that paid off in playground rumours. That 151st slot ended up load-bearing for the entire franchise. Mewtwo's whole existence depends on Mew existing. The first film depends on it. Enormous quantities of merchandise depend on it. All of that traces back to a programmer with a few hundred spare bytes deciding, essentially, why not? I don't know. There's something quite hopeful about that. The most valuable thing in the box was the thing nobody signed off on. Now, since we're on the subject of things in red and blue that weren't quite meant to be there, let's talk about the other one. The one that actually was a mistake. A couple of small things worth adding, since we've got the time and it's late. The glitch that actually produced Mew for people wasn't the truck, obviously, and it wasn't the coastline trick either. It came from a different quirk involving trainer encounters. You'd get a trainer to spot you, escape the battle in a particular way, and the game would leave a value hanging around that determined what wild Pokémon you'd meet next. Line it up correctly, and the number that came out was 21, which is Mew's internal index, not its Pokédex number, its position in the game's actual list, which is a different and much scrappier set of values. So the way to get Mew was to walk up to a lad with a butterfly net, look at him from a specific distance, and then leave. Which is the least mystical possible route to the most mystical creature in the game. And I love that about it. The Pokédex entry didn't help matters either. Mew is described as containing the genetic composition of every Pokémon, all of them, in one small pink thing. And in the first generation, it could be taught essentially any move in the game. Both of those facts fed straight back into the playground economy. If a kid claimed to have one, the claim wasn't just, I have a rare Pokémon, it was, I have the one that can do everything. Almost all of them had a Game Shark. Some of them didn't even have that and were simply lying, which took a certain amount of nerve, since sooner or later somebody would ask to see it on a link cable. The other thing I'd flag is what all this did to the shape of the franchise afterwards. Every generation since has had its version of Mew, a mythical Pokémon distributed through events rather than found in the game. Celebi, Gyruchi, Deoxys, on and on. That's now a permanent structural feature of these games, an entire category of monster defined by the fact that you can't get it by playing, and it exists because a programmer had 300 bytes going spare and used them on a joke. Everyone remembers the sound first. That's the thing about Missing No. Not the sprite, not the name, not what it did to your bag. The sound. That awful stretched out squawk it makes when it appears, which is really just the game reading the wrong bit of memory and playing whatever it finds there. But at 9 years old, it sounded like the cartridge screaming at you. And then the sprite, this tall, ragged column of grey static, vaguely shaped like a backwards L, which is not an image of anything. It's the game trying to draw a picture that was never drawn. I've never quite gotten over how much of a shared cultural moment this was for people of a certain age. You didn't find Missing No by exploring. Somebody told you. There was always somebody, a cousin, a kid 2 years above you, a lad at the swimming pool, who had the instructions, and the instructions were passed on with the seriousness of a state secret. Here's what's actually happening, and I'll go slowly because it's a genuinely elegant bit of broken. Red and Blue have 256 slots for Pokémon data. There are 151 Pokémon, so there are quite a lot of slots that contain nothing in particular, leftover space that was never filled in. When the game is asked to produce a Pokémon from one of those empty slots, it doesn't refuse. It just goes and gets whatever is sitting in that address and does its best. That's the first ingredient. The second ingredient is the old man in Viridian City. He offers to show you how to catch a Pokémon, and he does it by taking over. The game briefly makes him the player. To do that, it shoves your name out of the way and parks it somewhere temporarily. And the place it parks it happens to be the same chunk of memory the game uses to keep track of which wild Pokémon live in the grass you're standing in. Normally this is fine. You walk into any patch of grass, the game loads the proper encounter list for that area, your name gets overwritten, no harm done, which brings us to Cinnoh Island. There's a strip of shoreline on the east coast where the water meets the land, and those tiles were flagged incorrectly. The game treats them as if they're grass. So you surf along that edge, the game says, right, time for a wild encounter, what lives here, and finds that nobody ever wrote an encounter table for a beach. So it uses what's already there, which is your name. That's the whole trick. Talk to the old man, fly straight to Cinnoh without touching any grass on the way, surf up and down the coastline, and the game will generate wild Pokémon out of the letters of your name. I find that genuinely beautiful, and I'm not being ironic about it. The monster is spelled by you. Different names produce different results. Some produce high-level ordinary Pokémon, some produce glitched trainers, and some produce the famous grey column. It's why the kid at school who did it and it didn't work wasn't lying. Their name just spelled something else. Then there's the bag thing. Encountering Missing No, you didn't even have to catch it, would take whatever was in the 6th slot of your item bag and add 128 to it. Rare candies, master balls, whatever was sitting in position 6. For a game where master balls were rationed out, one per playthrough, this was, to a child, essentially printing money, which put Nintendo in an awkward spot, because the duplication trick was so good that people were doing it on purpose, and doing it on purpose meant deliberately corrupting your own save. So in the May 1999 issue of Nintendo Power, They documented the whole thing, laid out the steps, and attached a warning that any contact with it, even if you didn't catch it, could wipe your game file or wreck your graphics, which is a very strange piece of official communication when you sit with it. That's a company publishing a walkthrough for its own bug in its own magazine, essentially saying, we know, here's how it works, please stop. The graphical damage was real, by the way, and mostly cosmetic. Your Hall of Fame records got scrambled. Sprites went funny. Nothing that actually stopped you playing. But the warning did its job, and a healthy chunk of a generation now carries a low-level superstition about it. The regional stuff is where this gets properly nerdy, and I love it, so bear with me. The Spanish and Italian versions of red and blue got fixed. Somebody changed those shoreline tiles to behave like proper water, and that was that. The German and French versions did not get fixed, except in French, where the game freezes solid when missing no shows up, which is arguably worse than the original problem. Yellow removed the whole thing properly by blanking the encounter data before writing over it and reprogramming those tiles so they don't call for wild Pokémon at all. So depending on which country you were in and which version you bought, you either had a legend, a crash, or nothing. And then delightfully, the 2016 re-releases of Red and Blue on the 3DS shipped with the glitch intact. They didn't fix it. 20 years on, with all the ability in the world to patch it out, they left it in. I choose to believe someone made that decision deliberately, and I refuse to hear otherwise. Here's what I think is the actually interesting question. Underneath all this, and it's the reason Missing No earns a spot in a mysteries video rather than a bug list video. Missing No was never a Pokémon. It's the absence of one, rendered visible. The game had a shape where a creature should go and no creature to put in it, so it printed the shape, and an entire generation looked at that shape and decided it was a secret. Because that's what everyone thought, wasn't it? Not, this is broken. The prevailing theory at my school was that the garbled thing was Mew, that the developers had hidden the real one behind a deliberate wall of nonsense, and if you did it enough times, you'd get through, which is completely wrong, and also, given what we now know about how Mew got in there in the first place, a bit closer to the spirit of things than it had any right to be. There are fans who've spent years trying to fold Missing No into the fiction, treating it as a character, giving it a personality, writing it into stories as some sort of ghost in the machine. Academics have written about it. It got studied as a piece of gaming culture rather than a piece of code. All for a thing that is, in the most literal sense, nothing at all. Nintendo have never officially acknowledged it as anything other than an error, which is the correct and boring position for them to take, but they haven't been able to leave it alone either. There's a little visual glitch that looks like it tucked away in Lumiose City in the Carlos games, visible only if you angle the camera exactly right, which we'll come back to much later on, because Lumiose has rather a lot of odd things in it. For now, I'll just say this. Of all the things in Red and Blue that ended up mattering, the one that mattered most was the one nobody wrote. Anyway, since we've spent a while on things that shouldn't be in the game, let's go and talk about something that is definitely, officially, on purpose in the game, and is somehow much worse. 2 more bits worth having, because the glitch has a wider family than most people realise. There's a close relative called M', which is how the game renders another undefined slot. Same origin, different data, and it behaves differently. It's the one people bring up in relation to certain evolution arguments, which we'll get to shortly. For now, the thing worth knowing is that these aren't one glitch. There are a whole population of them, and which one you meet depends entirely on the letters you happen to type into a name field when you were 9. And Cinnoh isn't the only place it works. There's a stretch of shore east of the rightmost Seafoam Islands cave that has the same problem, which means you can do the whole thing from Fuchsia instead. There's also a genuinely baroque version involving the Safari Zone, where the encounter data from the safari zone leaks out and follows you around, so you end up fighting safari animals on a beach at the wrong end of the country. That's the bit that I think doesn't get appreciated enough. This isn't a single mistake. It's a whole region of the game where the boundaries between areas have gone soft, and things from one place turn up in another. There's a community that studies this stuff properly, and has been doing so for decades, mapping the memory, documenting every variant, building tools. They've catalogued things far stranger than the grey column. There are glitch cities you can fall into, corrupted map data that generates places that aren't places, whole zones assembled out of debris that no designer ever touched, which means somewhere in the guts of a 1996 Game Boy cartridge, there are locations that have never been visited by anyone who wasn't specifically looking for them, made of nothing, that will generate themselves identically every time you go. I want to be careful not to make that sound more atmospheric than it is, because none of it is haunted and none of it is hidden content. It's just a very old game running out of instructions and improvising, the same way it improvised the grey column. But there is something quite pleasing about the fact that the improvising is consistent. Go back tomorrow and you'll get the same nonsense in the same order, because the nonsense isn't random. It's a fixed consequence of an oversight nobody has ever bothered to correct. I want to handle this one carefully, and I want to do it a bit differently to how it usually gets done. Normally, a video like this would sit on the Lavender Town story for ages, dangling it, going, but was it real, for 10 minutes before admitting it wasn't. I'm not going to do that, because it's a horrible story, and the tease is the worst part of it. So I'll tell you up front, the famous version is completely made up. It's fiction, written by a person on the internet in 2010, and it has been thoroughly picked apart. What's interesting isn't the story. What's interesting is why it worked. Because there are two entirely real things sitting underneath it, and the fake grew in the gap between them. Let's start with the music, since that's the bit that's actually true. Lavender Town is the graveyard. It's where the Pokémon Tower is, where deceased Pokémon are buried, where you find the ghosts. It was composed by Junichi Masuda, and the track he wrote for it is, even now, even knowing everything, deeply unpleasant to sit inside. It's high, it's thin, it doesn't resolve, and it loops. On the actual hardware, through the Game Boy's tinny little speaker, it has a quality that's difficult to describe, sort of like a smoke alarm having a bad dream. And it genuinely is different between versions. The Japanese release of Red and Green has a version that sounds noticeably harsher than what the rest of the world got a couple of years later. That's not a conspiracy claim, that's just a thing you can go and listen to. Why it changed is much less dramatic than people want it to be. Sound design gets adjusted between regions all the time, and the Game Boy's sound chip did different things depending on how you drove it. But the music was changed for the international release is a true sentence, and true sentences are exactly what a good lie needs to stand on. Now the second real thing, which is where it gets genuinely grim. On the 16th of December, 1997, TV Tokyo aired episode 38 of the Pokémon anime. In Japanese, it's Denno Senshi Porygon, usually translated as Electric Soldier Porygon. Roughly 4.6 million households watched it. About 20 minutes in, there's a sequence where Pikachu hits a set of missiles with a thunderbolt, and the resulting explosion was animated using two techniques the industry called Paka Paka and Flash. What that meant in practice was bright red and blue strobing, blinking at somewhere around 12 times a second, for about 6 seconds. Japan's Fire Defense Agency reported that 685 viewers were taken to hospital, 310 boys and 375 girls. Most recovered quickly. A good number were fine by the time the ambulance arrived, but well over 100 were admitted, and 2 stayed in for more than a fortnight. The Japanese press called it Pokémon shock, and the fallout was enormous. Nintendo's share price dropped. The anime went off the air completely and didn't come back until April of 1998. 2 episodes that were meant to air in the meantime got delayed so long they eventually went out in the wrong order, which caused mild chaos of its own, since Ash still had a Charmander and Misty didn't have Togepi yet. The episode has never aired again. Not in Japan, not anywhere, not once in nearly 30 years. And Porygon, who genuinely had nothing to do with it, the flashing came from Pikachu's attack, has been quietly frozen out of the anime ever since, which is a bit rough on Porygon. The lasting effect was broadcast guidelines, flashing images, especially red ones, capped at 3 times per second. Anything without red, capped at 5. No flashing for more than 2 seconds at a stretch. Those rules exist because of one Tuesday evening. So, hold those 2 things in your head. The music sounds wrong on purpose and was changed for the West. And Pokémon, as a documented historical fact, once sent hundreds of Japanese children to hospital via the television. You can see the shape of the lie already, can't you? The story turned up on Pastebin on the 21st of February, 2010, and then got picked up and reworked on 4chan and the various creepypasta sites, which is how these things spread. The claim was that after Red and Green launched in Japan, there was a spike in deaths among children roughly 10 to 15 years old. The numbers quoted range from about 100 to a couple of hundred, depending on which retelling you read. The proposed cause was frequencies buried in the Lavender Town theme, audible only to children because their hearing is more sensitive, causing headaches, nosebleeds, insomnia, and worse. And the tidy little bow on top, the music was hastily changed for the international release, so it wouldn't happen anywhere else. None of it happened. There was no spike. There's no coroner's data, no contemporaneous reporting, no investigation, nothing. Japan keeps rather good records, and a cluster of deaths on that scale, connected to a single product, would not have quietly evaporated. But look at how well it's built. It borrows the real music change. It borrows the emotional shape of a real incident where Pokémon media genuinely harmed children through a sensory effect. It puts them together, and it lands in exactly the gap where a person's instinct says, well, that sort of thing did happen once. There's a follow-up chapter to the story that I actually enjoy, because it's the bit that falls over most, obviously. The claim goes that somebody ran the original Japanese Lavender Town track through a spectrogram, a tool that turns sound into a picture, and hidden in the image was a ghostly figure, followed by a row of unknown spelling out a message. Depending on the version you read, it says, "Get out" or "Leave now." Unknown are the alphabet Pokémon, each one shaped like a letter. They're a lovely bit of design, and they are also, crucially, from Gold and Silver, which came out in Japan at the tail end of 1999. Nearly 3 years after Red and Green, so the hidden warning in the 1996 game is written in an alphabet that wouldn't be invented until 1999. Which is a hell of a thing for a cover-up operation to overlook. The video that supposedly showed all this has since been taken down, which is convenient in the way these things always are. I want to be a bit sincere for a second, because I think there's a real point in here. I don't have a problem with creepypasta. Ghost stories are one of the oldest things we do, and doing them about a Game Boy cartridge is genuinely charming. What I dislike about this particular one is that it hangs a fictional body count on a real event where real families had a real bad night. The 685 figure isn't a spooky number. Those were actual kids, some of whom went on to have ongoing problems, and their evening got turned into set dressing for a story about a haunted MIDI file. And the daft thing is, Lavender Town didn't need the help. It's already the best designed, unsettling place in the series. You walk into a town where every building is a mourning house, and the only thing to do is climb a tower full of graves. There's an NPC who tells you about a Marowak that died there. The whole area is about grief in a game aimed at 8-year-olds, and it commits to it completely. The composer wrote something genuinely uncomfortable, on purpose, because the town is a cemetery. That's not a conspiracy. That's just very good work. If you want to be properly unnerved by Lavender Town, don't listen to the story about the frequencies. Go and read the Pokédex entry for the small brown thing standing in the tower's basement, which, as it happens, is where we're going next. A bit more about the town itself, since I've spent this whole section talking about what didn't happen there. The Pokémon Tower is 7 floors. Every floor is graves and channelers, trainers in a sort of trance state, who don't react to you normally. Their Pokémon are ghosts you can't see and can't hit, because the first generation had no way to target them until you get the right item. So for a stretch of the game, you walk into a building where you're functionally defenseless, and people keep starting fights with you. That's an unusual design choice for a game aimed at children, and it works enormously well. Most difficulty in Red and Blue is about numbers. This bit is about not being able to do anything at all. And on the top floor there's Mr. Fuji and the volunteer house next door, full of Pokémon that somebody abandoned, which is its own quiet piece of writing. The other detail I'd mention is that the creepypasta has more limbs than the version I described. There's a whole component about a hand, a white hand that supposedly appears in certain frames, that got added later by other people, which is how these stories grow. Nobody owns them. Somebody posts a thing, somebody else adds a detail, and after a few years, it has a canon of its own that no single author wrote. Search interest in the whole business peaked around 2012 and has been declining ever since, which tells you something about how these things burn. 2 years from a pastebin post to global saturation, then a slow fade. The music, meanwhile, has been rearranged officially several times. The Heart Gold and Soul Silver version is fuller and warmer. The Let's Go version is orchestral and almost pretty. Every time they've touched it, they've softened it slightly, which I understand and which I think is a small loss. The original works because it doesn't sound like music written for a game. It sounds like a fault. The Pokédex is, for the most part, a fairly cheerful document. Lots of entries about how fast something runs or how much it likes berries. Occasionally, it goes somewhere odd. Drifloon carrying children off. Mimikyu killing anyone who sees under the cloth. But those read as spooky story spooky. Halloween spooky. Kubona's entry doesn't read like that. Kubone's entry reads like a fact. It wears the skull of its dead mother. That's it. That's the design. The little brown creature with the bone club is wearing its mum's head. And the mask is stained with tear tracks. And when it cries, the sound echoes inside the skull and comes out as a sad little melody. Later, entries add that it evolves once it comes to terms with the grief. 30 years and 9 generations of games. And they have never softened this. They've had every opportunity. They've quietly edited plenty of other things. This one stays. So the obvious question is the one everyone asks eventually. Whose skull is it actually? The games do answer this, and they answer it in the most upsetting way available. It's a Marowak, Kubone's own evolved form, which means the family line is small orphan wearing parent's skull becomes the thing whose skull gets worn. It's a closed loop of the worst possible kind. And it isn't just Pokédex text. Red and Blue put it in front of you as a plot beat. In the Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town, you meet a ghost you can't fight properly. You need the Sylph-scope to see what it is, and when you do, it's a Marowak, killed by Team Rocket, who wanted the Kubone's mother out of the way for reasons the game leaves fairly vague. You have to defeat the ghost so it can rest. There's no capture, no reward, no item, it just goes. That's in a children's game, Pokémon Red and Blue, from 1998, that you played on a bus. Now, the theory. There's a long-running idea in the fandom that the skull belongs to a Kangaskhan, and the case for it is better than you think, which is why it's survived this long. Kangaskhan is the kangaroo one, with a baby permanently in its pouch. In the wild, every Kangaskhan you meet is female. The baby in the pouch has a rounded head, a stubby tail, small clawed limbs, and a general silhouette that looks, If you squint, and everyone did squint, quite a lot like a Cubone. So the theory runs like this. A mother Kangaskhan dies. The baby is left in the world with no protection and no way to defend itself. So it takes the skull and the bone and carries on. That's a Cubone. It grows into a Marowak, and a female Marowak eventually becomes a Kangaskhan, and the cycle starts again. The reason people believe Game Freak cut it, according to the theory, is that an orphaned baby kangaroo wearing its mother's severed head was a bit much for a game about collecting friendly monsters, so Kangaskhan got detached and left as a standalone. And then there's the evidence people bring out as the clincher, which is a glitch Pokémon. If you go and do the Cinnabar coastline trick we talked about earlier, and you come away with the glitch known as M, which is a close cousin of the Grey Column, you can level it up. And under the right conditions it evolves into Kangaskhan, which sounds enormously incriminating. A broken slot in the data, sitting there, evolving into the exact Pokémon the theory says should be at the end of that chain. Right, let me take the other side because I think the theory is wrong, and I think it's wrong in an interesting way. Start with the skull itself. Look at it properly, not from memory. Cubone's skull has a pronounced downward groove, forming a snout and a large tooth-like protrusions at the front. Kangaskhan's head is broad, round and blunt with nothing like that shape. They aren't the same object, they aren't close. Then the limbs. The baby in Kangaskhan's pouch has 3 claws on each hand and 2 toes on each foot. Cubone has a single toe per foot and 2 small thumb claws. If you're going to build a theory on physical resemblance, the physical resemblance has to survive being looked at. Then the glitch evolution, which is the one people find hardest to let go of. Glitch Pokémon evolve into whatever the corrupted data happens to point at. That's the whole nature of them, they're arbitrary. Reading meaning into which Pokémon a piece of garbage data lands on is like reading meaning into which word a keyboard produces when a cat sits on it. And most importantly, the game already told you. The ghost in the tower is a Marowak, not an unidentified Pokémon, not a mystery. The game specifically hands you a device so you can see what it is, and then shows you. So why won't the theory die? Partly because Alola came along and complicated everything. The Alolan version of Marowak is fire and ghost type, which is a strange combination for a ground-dwelling bone creature, and the entries lean into it. One describes it dancing through the night in mourning for its fallen allies, which is gorgeous writing, honestly, and it did something unintended. Fans immediately went, hang on, if the mother's spirit is fire, was the mother a fire type? And a whole splinter theory grew up, proposing that Cubone's parent is a Charizard, which is even less supportable than the Kangaskhan version, and which I have a soft spot for anyway, because at least it's imaginative. Here's my actual take, and then we'll move on. I think the Kangaskhan theory is almost certainly wrong, and I think it's the single best wrong theory in the whole franchise. Because the thing it does is send people back to a game they played as a child to reread the small print. That's a rare thing for a piece of fan speculation to achieve. Most theories ask you to accept something. This one asks you to go and look. And what you find when you look is that the real answer was sitting there the whole time, in plainer language than you remembered, and it's sadder than the theory. Kangaskhan, for what it's worth, has been left entirely alone by all of this. Just quietly getting on with it, baby in pouch, no dark secret, occasionally being given a mega evolution, where the baby comes out and fights, which I think it deserves after 3 decades of being accused of things. Right, since we're already in the business of Kanto's grimmer paperwork, there's a building on Cinnabar Island that's worth a visit. It isn't there anymore, which is part of the problem. There are a few more entries in this family that don't get read out often enough, and they don't get any cheerier. There's one about Mandibuzz, the vulture from Unova, which describes it hunting Cubone specifically. By sight, by listening for the crying. The sound a grieving orphan makes echoing inside a skull travels, and something out there has learned what it means. That's a food chain built on bereavement, in a game with a shop that sells hats. A Lola made the whole thing worse in the best way. In those games, Marowak isn't a rarity, it's a fixture. There are a lot of them, and they're culturally significant to the region rather than just wildlife. There's a bone-twirling fire dance that they perform, and the entry frames it as mourning. Not for their own mothers, for others of their kind generally. It's a funeral rite performed by animals at night that the local humans watch. I don't know of another mainstream children's franchise that would put that in, and then move straight on to a shopping segment. The other place this got treated properly is Pokémon Origins, the short animated adaptation of Red and Blue that came out in 2013. It's 4 episodes and it takes the game seriously in a way the main anime never has time to. The Lavender Town material is in there, handled bluntly, and seeing it animated rather than read off a text box does something to it. The tower stops being an area with good music and becomes a place where a specific thing happened to a specific animal because some men in uniforms wanted something. And that's really why I think this whole design has survived 30 years of softening. Game Freak have edited plenty of text. They've quietly removed lines from other places for being too much. This one they've kept generation after generation. In every language, in every remake, somebody keeps deciding it stays. One last thing, and it's about the name. Cubona, cub and bone. That's the whole joke, and it's a pun, and it's cheerful. Somebody sat in a room and came up with a light little wordplay name for a small dinosaur with a club, and somebody else on the same team wrote the entry that explains where the skull came from. Both of those decisions are in the same creature. That's the tension that makes the first generation what it is, a design language that's genuinely playful, sitting directly on top of writing that isn't playful at all, with no attempt to reconcile them. Somebody in the games treats it as remarkable too. Trainers use Cubone, shops sell items for it. There's a character somewhere in 30 years who stops and says, "Hang on, what's on its head?" It's simply part of the world, accepted, unexamined, walking around in the grass outside town. The Pokémon Mansion is on Cinnabar Island, and it's a proper ruin. Holes in the floors, statues with switches hidden inside them, burglars and scientists picking through the wreckage for anything worth taking. You go there because you need the secret key to get into the gym, which means an enormous number of players stomped through the entire place, looking for a door key, and read absolutely none of the paperwork lying around, which is a shame because the paperwork is the most important text in the first generation. There are diary entries scattered across the floors, and they're scattered. That's not me being poetic. They aren't in order. Depending on which route you take through the building, you'll very likely read them backwards, or read the last one first, which does interesting things to the experience. Put in order, they go roughly like this. The first entry is dated July the 5th. A new Pokémon was discovered deep in the jungle in Guyana, South America. The second says they named it Mew. The third, and this is the one that stops people, says that Mew gave birth. The fourth says the new Pokémon was too powerful, that they failed to curb its vicious tendencies. And that's it. That's the origin of Mewtwo, as told by the game. 4 short paragraphs in a burnt-out building on an island, easily missed, never referenced by any character out loud. I want to sit on the gave birth line for a moment because it's genuinely peculiar. The version of this story most people know comes from the first film. An eyelash, a lab, cloning, a tank. That's a science story. What the game describes is closer to a pregnancy. Something in the phrasing suggests a creature rather than a procedure, and it's much stranger for it. Now the translation stuff, which is where this gets properly interesting. In the original Japanese, the journal's read as though one person is doing all of this. One researcher alone, keeping a diary. The English localization changed it to refer to a team of researchers. That's a small edit with quite large consequences. One scientist alone in a mansion on a volcanic island, conducting increasingly unwise experiments and writing it all down, is a completely different story to a funded research group. It's a much lonelier and much more sinister picture, and it lines up with the Pokédex, which has often described Mewtwo as being made by scientific experimentation. There's more. When Kanto was remade again for Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, the Guyana reference was taken out entirely. And in the English version of those games, the line about Mew giving birth went too. So the further we get from 1996, the vaguer the story becomes. That's not a conspiracy. That's just localization and audience standards drift over 30 years. But it does mean the fullest version of Mewtwo's origin exists in the oldest and least read version of the text, which is a slightly melancholy state of affairs for a piece of lore. Now, who wrote the journals? The game never says. It's unsigned. But there's a fairly well-supported reading that points at Mr. Fuji. Mr. Fuji is the old man in Lavender Town who looks after abandoned Pokémon in the volunteer house. He's the one connected to the Marowak business we just talked about, and he gives you the Poké Flute. Kind, gentle, entirely uninterested in battling. The suggestion, and this is a fan reading rather than confirmed canon, so hold it loosely, is that before Lavender Town, he was on Cinnoh running the lab and went by Dr. Fuji, which would make the man spending his old age caring for orphaned Pokémon in a town full of graves, the same man who made Mewtwo. That's an extraordinarily good story if it's true. It's a redemption arc conveyed entirely through where a character has chosen to live. There's a thin thread of supporting evidence that I like a lot, and it's the sort of thing that only exists because people go through Japanese text files with a fine comb. In the Japanese version of Emerald, there's a message left on a signpost on Faraway Island, the little hidden place where you can encounter Mew, and it contains the remnant of a signature, a name ending in ZG, which has led to the idea that the jungle in the journals and Faraway Island are the same place, and that whoever wrote that signpost is whoever wrote the diary. It isn't proof, it's a syllable, but it's the exact sort of breadcrumb that keeps people awake. Then there's the detail that Generation 7 added when Kanto got rebuilt again with proper 3D models, and it's the one I actually find hardest to shake. Down in the mansion's basement there are glass containers, big ones, the sort you'd expect in a lab like this, and the largest of them shows damage, clear signs of having been struck repeatedly, over and over. From the inside, that's it. Nobody comments on it. There's no text box. It's set dressing. But somebody on the environment team decided that 20 years after the fact, the tank should still show what happened. And I think about that more than is entirely healthy. And this is what makes all of this permanently unresolvable. In-universe, the mansion is gone. Between Generation 1 and Generation 2, the Sinnoh volcano erupts. The island is largely destroyed. The mansion, the lab, the gym, the journals, all of it. By the time you visit Kanto in Gold and Silver, there's essentially nothing there but rubble and a Pokémon Center. Blaine has relocated. The evidence is under lava. So even inside the fiction, the record of how Mewtwo was made is now unrecoverable. The only people who ever read those pages were a handful of 11-year-olds who wandered into the wrong room looking for a key. I find that genuinely lovely, in a bleak sort of way. The most consequential document in Kanto was optional reading, presented out of order, in a building that would later be buried, in a game where the main objective was to become the best at a sport. And nobody in universe seems to have gone looking. Mewtwo lives in a cave at the bottom of Cerulean Cave, which the game describes as somewhere untrained people shouldn't go, and the whole society appears to have collectively decided that's fine. No investigation, no inquiry. The strongest creature anyone had ever made escaped, levelled a building, and everyone shrugged and went back to the gym circuit, which, now that I say it out loud, might be the most realistic thing in the entire series. Anyway, that's Kanto's paperwork problem. Let's talk about Kanto's other paperwork problem, which is that a man in Vermilion City mentions something enormous exactly once and then never brings it up again. 2 more threads that hang off this, and then I'll leave the island alone. The first is where Mewtwo ends up. Cerulean Cave, called Unknown Dungeon in the original, is a place the game actively discourages you from entering. There's a guard who won't let you in until you've beaten the Elite Four, and the reasoning he gives is essentially that people who go in don't handle it well. The Pokémon in there are far above anything else in Kanto. It's the only genuine post-game content in the first generation, and there's only implied story attached to it whatsoever. You walk in, you go down 3 floors, and it's sitting there. No dialogue. There is a confrontation with Mewtwo in its first generation game encounter. It doesn't accuse you of anything or explain itself. That was left entirely to the film, which gave Mewtwo a voice, a philosophy, and a great deal of resentment, none of which the game supports or contradicts. I'd argue the silent version is stronger. A creature that was made on purpose escaped, destroyed the building it was made in, and then went and sat in a cave behind a city, and when a child eventually finds it, has nothing at all to say. The second thread is the manga, which is a completely different animal and worth mentioning because it's the version that commits hardest. In Pokémon Adventures, the long-running comic, Mewtwo's creation is tied directly to Blaine, the Cinnabar gym leader, the fire-type one with the riddles, who's written as having worked for Team Rocket on the project, which recasts a cheerful old man in a lab coat as somebody carrying an enormous amount of guilt. That's manga canon rather than game canon, and the two have never been reconciled. But it does mean there are at least 3 separate accounts of who made Mewtwo, a solitary diarist, a corporate research team, and a gym leader with a secret, depending entirely on which shelf you took it off, which is quite fitting for a story whose only primary source got buried in a volcano. One structural detail about the building I've always liked since we're leaving. The doors in the mansion are opened by switches, and the switches are hidden inside statues. Statues of Mew. Several statues of Mew scattered across 4 floors in a building that was abandoned, which means somebody commissioned and installed decorative sculptures of the thing they were making, presumably while they were still making it, and then wired the building's locks into them. That's either enormous professional pride or the last stage of somebody losing their grip. And given everything else in those diary entries, I know which way I'd lean. Vermilion City. 3rd gym. You walk in, you get past the electric barriers with the bins and the switches that everyone hated, and you meet a very large man in army fatigues with spiked blonde hair. He says something like, "Hey kid, what do you think you're doing here? You won't last long in combat." And then, "I tell you kid, electric Pokémon saved me during the war. They zapped my enemies into paralysis, and that's it." He never mentions it again. Nobody else mentions it directly as a global event, but others do reference his military service. You get on a boat, you beat him, you get the Thunder Badge. That single line has generated more fan theory than almost anything else in the series, and I want to walk through it honestly, because I think most treatments of it are far too keen to tell you it's all true. First, the supporting material, because there is some, and it's usually skipped over. Inside the gym, there's a trainer, Gentleman Tucker, who tells you that Litzy Surge was his commanding officer in the army. So Surge didn't just serve, he led. He had men under him, and at least one of them followed him into a career of standing in a room waiting for children to challenge him, which is a bleak little detail if you think about it too long. Then there's the Fame Checker, which was a feature in Fire Red and Leaf Green, a sort of in-game biography tool where you'd collect facts about notable people. Surge's entry mentions that he was known in the army for his caution. Not his bravery, his caution. That's a very specific characterization, and it implies a context where being cautious was the thing that kept you alive. And then there's the name. Outside the Vermilion Gym, there's a sign that calls him the Lightning American. In later releases, that got softened to a vaguer, faraway region, presumably because the Pokémon world had by then developed its own geography, and having America sitting in it was awkward. But in the original, He's plainly a foreigner, plainly military, plainly from somewhere else. So, a foreign officer, decorated by implication, living in a port town, running a gym, with a subordinate still by his side. You can see why people built something out of that. What they built is called the Great Pokémon War, or the Kanto War, and the case goes roughly as follows. Look at who's actually in Kanto. Children, teenagers, and old people. The adult men you meet are almost exclusively either gym leaders or criminals, and in Giovanni's case, both at once. There's very little in between. No ordinary blokes going to ordinary jobs. Your character has a mother and no father. Your rival has a grandfather and no parents at all. Kanto has an enormous number of hospitals. Almost every town has a Pokémon Center, and essentially no leisure infrastructure. No cinemas, no theatres, just a single arcade, nothing you'd build in a place with spare time and spare money. There's a man in Vermilion rebuilding something with a Machop, which the theory treats as post-war reconstruction. And there's the underground network. Kanto has these long tunnels connecting routes, and the theory holds that they were originally shelters. Put together, it paints a picture. A society that lost a chunk of a generation, that rebuilt its hospitals first and its entertainment last, that handed responsibility to children because there weren't enough adults left, and that has quietly agreed not to discuss any of it. It's a fantastic piece of fan writing. I have enormous affection for it. I also think it's almost certainly not there. Here's the honest accounting. There are no war memorials in Kanto. There are no battlefields. There are no veterans besides Surge. No widows, no ruins that the game identifies as ruins from a conflict, no history books, no museums about it, and Kanto has a museum in Pewter City, which is full of fossils and a space rocket rather than anything about a recent war. Nobody grieves, nobody refers to it obliquely. In 30 years of sequels, remakes, spin-offs, and an anime that has run continuously the entire time, nobody has picked the thread up. The theory rests on one sentence and a lot of absence. And absence is a slippery thing to build on, because there are much more boring explanations for all of it. The reason there are no cinemas in Kanto is that a Game Boy cartridge from 1996 had a finite amount of room, and cinemas aren't gameplay. The reason your dad isn't around is that the game needs one parent in one house to say goodbye to you, and the story is about leaving home. The reason everyone you meet is a child is that the target audience was children. The tunnels are tunnels because there's a mountain in the way. Now, I want to be fair to the theory, because there's one piece of it I do think is real, and it's about Surge specifically rather than Kanto generally. Whoever wrote that line wrote it deliberately. You don't have a character say the war in a children's game by accident. Every other gym leader gets a personality quirk. Misty likes water types, Erica likes flowers, Sabrina is unsettling. Surge gets a biography. Somebody sat down and decided this man had a past and gave him one line to convey it. And then the writers who came after inherited that line and mostly left it where it was rather than expanding on it, which is either restraint or nobody wanting to touch it. The other thing worth saying is that the war as a phrase does an enormous amount of work in ordinary speech. My grandparents said the war and meant one specific thing without ever needing to name it. If you're localizing a Japanese script into English in 1998 and you have a character who's an American soldier, the war is a very natural thing to write and doesn't necessarily imply a fictional conflict at all. It might just be a real one, which raises the genuinely odd possibility that Latino Surge is a veteran of a war that happened in our world, in a game set in a world with talking rock monsters, and nobody has ever clarified it. I'll say this in the theory's defense, and it's the thing that makes me not want to dismiss it entirely. Pokémon absolutely is willing to put a war in a game. It's done it. There's a region where the conflict is canon, documented, dated, and has a body count you can walk past. That's Kalos, and we'll get there properly later on. I mention it now only because it changes the argument slightly. If Game Freak were categorically unwilling to write about war, Surge's line would be an obvious localization quirk, and that would be the end of it. They aren't unwilling. They just chose, in Kanto, not to. So we're left with a gym leader who said something enormous once in passing, and a country that never followed it up. Which, out of everything in this video, is probably the one I'd most like a real answer to, and is probably the one least likely to ever get one. Right, let's leave Kanto entirely and go north, where there's a burnt building with something in the basement and a legend that the games and the cartoon can't agree on. A few odds and ends about Surge himself before we leave Vermilion, because he's a more carefully built character than his one line suggests. His Japanese name is Machisu, and the readings people usually give it point at either machine or march, both fitting for a soldier. Though there's a competing reading that it comes from clematis, a flowering plant, because the gym leaders in the original games were quietly named after plants as a set, which produces the pleasing possibility that the most militarized character in Kanto is named after a climbing vine. And nobody noticed. The fame checker itself is worth a mention as a piece of design, actually, because it's the only time the series has built a proper mechanic around gossip. You'd collect fragments of information about notable people by talking to the right NPCs in the right places, and the fragments would assemble into something like a profile. It's a lovely idea that they used once and then dropped, and it's where a decent chunk of what we know about Surge's army career comes from. The anime made him a bully, incidentally. Ash fights him fairly early on, and Surge is written as arrogant, dismissive, and openly contemptuous of small Pokémon, which sets up a satisfying comeuppance and has essentially nothing to do with the game's version. There's no war material in it. The soldier thing is aesthetic. The jacket, the haircut, the attitude, and the biography is gone. Which is the pattern, really. Some adaptations of this character after 1996 have kept the costume and dropped the history. I keep coming back to the fact that the line survives at all. It's still there in Fire Red and Leaf Green. It's still there in Let's Go. 30 years of remakes, translations, ratings, reviews, and content standards, and a man in a children's game still tells you that electric Pokémon saved him during the war. Anybody could have quietly taken it out at any point in those 30 years, and it would have cost nothing and nobody would have complained. And as far as I can tell, it has never happened. Which doesn't prove there was a war. It just means somebody every single time has looked at that sentence and decided it was worth keeping. And I'd quite like to know what they thought they were keeping it for. The burned tower in Akrutik City is one of my favourite spaces in any of these games, and it's essentially just a floor with holes in it. You go in expecting the burned tower, and it is the burned tower. It's a wreck. The floorboards have gone, so you drop through into a basement, and down there, standing perfectly still in the dark, 3 of them, spaced out, are Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. They look at you, and then they leave. All 3 immediately, in 3 different directions. And now, they're somewhere in Johto, and you're going to spend the rest of the game trying to corner them at petrol stations and on bridges. That's the encounter. No battle, no dialogue, no explanation. 3 legendary creatures in a cellar who take one look at you and go. The story behind it is told to you in fragments by people around Akrutik, and it's this. There were 2 towers, twins, one at each end of the city. One of them was called the Brass Tower. 150 years before the events of Gold and Silver, lightning struck it, and it burned. The fire was eventually put out by a sudden downpour. 3 Pokémon were inside. They died in the fire. At sunrise the following morning, Ho-Oh appeared and gave them new life. That's where Raikou, Entei, and Suicune come from. And the 3 of them map onto the night itself. Raikou is the lightning that struck. Entei is the fire that took the building. Suicune is the rain that put it out. They're not just survivors of the event, they're the event, wearing bodies. Now here's the detail that most retellings drop, and it's the one that turns this from a nice legend into something genuinely unsettling. Nobody knows what those 3 Pokémon were. The games never say, not once. 3 unnamed Pokémon died in a fire and came back as something else entirely, and there is no record anywhere of what they'd been before. Which means either Ho-Oh restored them and changed them, or it restored them into what they already were, and the text is careful enough that you can't tell which. I lean towards changed. Because of what the town did afterwards. The people of Ecrutic watched this. They saw a Pokémon come down from the sky and undo death in front of them, and the first reaction, the accounts are quite clear on this, was awe. A miracle. Extraordinary. And then the awe curdled. It turned into fear. Not of the fire, not of the 3 revived creatures. Fear of Ho-Oh, specifically, because of what it had demonstrated it could do. Something that can hand life back can presumably do the reverse. Ho-Oh left. The accounts say it went looking for a trainer with a pure heart, which is the sort of phrasing that sounds lovely until you notice it's the behaviour of something that has just been rejected by an entire town. And Lugia, which some legends say used to perch on the tower, left too, and went to live in the Whirl Islands, in a cave, underwater, which is about as far from human attention as it's possible to get in Johto. So the whole event ends with everybody leaving. The city rebuilds one tower and not the other, and the second one, the one they built afterwards, in the hope Ho-Oh would come back, stayed empty for a century and a half. The building you climb at the end of Johto is a monument to somebody who didn't return. Now, the contradictions, because there are 2 good ones. The first is the anime, which tells the same story and gets the numbers completely different. In the episodes dealing with Ecrutic, Morty puts the fire 300 years back, not 150, and the cause isn't lightning, it's a war fought over Ho-Oh's power. That's not a small variation, that's a different event. A lightning strike is an accident, and the moral of the story is about grief and mercy. A war over the right to control a life-giving creature is a story about human greed, and it makes Ho-Oh's departure a lot less mysterious and a lot more understandable. The anime and the games have never reconciled this. Both versions are simply out there, told by the same character in different media, and you're free to pick. I prefer the games version for what it's worth. The lightning strike is better because it's nobody's fault. There's no villain to be angry at. 3 creatures were in a building on the wrong night, and a town got frightened of a miracle, and everyone involved dealt with it by leaving. The second contradiction is much newer, and it's the strangest thing to happen to this legend in 25 years. In Scarlet and Violet, there are creatures called Paradox Pokémon. We'll properly get into what those are much later, so I'll keep it light. 3 of them are Walking Wake, Gouging Fire, and Raging Bolt, and they look unmistakably like the legendary beasts. Bigger, rougher, more prehistoric, but the lineage is obvious the second you see them. Here's the wrinkle. There's an expedition in Paldean history, roughly 200 years before Scarlet, and one of its members was a sketch artist who drew a creature based on things they'd seen. An imagined thing, combining features. 200 years before Scarlet, the brass tower burned 150 years before gold and silver. Depending on how you line up the timelines of 2 regions that have never been formally synchronized, somebody in Paldea may have drawn a picture of Raikou, Entei and Suicune before they existed. The games offer conflicting accounts of what these things actually are. One reading is that they're ancestors, the ancient originals, from which the Johto beasts descend. Another is that they're versions of the beasts from a parallel timeline. The text doesn't settle it, and I don't think it's meant to, but it does something quietly wonderful to the tower story. Because if the paradox versions are ancestors, then the 3 unnamed Pokémon that died in that fire might have been these, which would mean Ho-Oh didn't invent Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. It restored something older into a smaller and gentler shape, and the enormous ragged originals only survive somewhere in a crater at the other end of the world. That's a theory. I want to be clear that it's a theory. But it's the good kind, where the game hands you 2 puzzle pieces from opposite ends of the box and declines to comment. And it doesn't touch the actual mystery, which remains completely open, and always has been. 3 Pokémon were in a tower. It burned. They died, something brought them back, and the town got scared and everybody left. Nobody wrote down who they were. Anyway. While we're on the subject of things written down and things left out, there's a library in Sinnoh with some deeply peculiar books on the top floor, and one of them says something in Japanese that it doesn't say in English. There are a few more pieces around Ekrutik that fill this in, and they're scattered across the city the way the Cinnabar journals were scattered across the mansion. The rebuilt tower, the one they put up hoping Ho-Oh would come back, has bells in it. According to the anime version, 3 bells were found in the ruins after the fire, completely untouched by the flames, and those bells went into the new building. That's where the name comes from, depending on your translation. It's called the Tin Tower in some releases, and the Bell Tower in others, which is one of those localization wobbles that gave a generation of fans 2 different names for the same building, and no way to know which was right. Then there's Yuzin, who is one of the great minor characters in the series. He's a man in a cape who has devoted his entire adult life to finding Suicune, specifically. Not all 3, just the one. He turns up repeatedly, always slightly too excited, always a step behind, and he never gets it. The game gives him no resolution. He's simply a person who has organised his whole existence around a creature that will not stop for him, which is, when you line it up, exactly what Ho-Oh did to the town. Everyone in this story is chasing something that has already decided to keep moving. There's also a strange thread connecting Suicune to the unknown, the alphabet ones. Some fans believe that Suicune is the closest of the 3 to Ho-Oh, and that it shares some kind of cooperative bond with the unknown, which live in the ruins of Alph southwest of Violet City. That's never developed. It's stated once by an old man and left, and in Crystal, Suicune becomes the centerpiece, new sprite, new music, an actual plot. The other 2 carry on being animals you chase around a map, so even within the legend, the 3 don't get equal treatment, which brings it back round, I suppose. 3 Pokémon went into that tower, only one of them got a story afterwards. And the very last piece, which is the first thing anyone ever saw. In the opening episode of the anime, the actual first one, the one that establishes everything, Ash is lying in a field at the end after a very bad day, and something enormous and golden flies overhead, and it's Ho-Oh in 1997. 2 years before gold and silver existed, and before anyone watching had any way of knowing what it was. It doesn't stop, it doesn't land, it just passes over and goes. Which, knowing what we know now about a creature that left a town and went looking for someone with a pure heart, is a considerably better bit of writing than it had any right to be. Canalave City is a port town with a lot of wooden decking and a library. The library has 3 floors, and the first 2 are essentially empty of anything useful. People sitting at tables, a sign telling you not to eat in here. It's very charming and very pointless. And then you go up to the top floor, and there are bookshelves you can actually read. There's no reason to. No item, no gym, no key. It's a room full of optional text, and what's in it is, I'd argue, the most ambitious writing in the entire series. The books are Sinnoh's myths, and they're not written like Pokédex entries. They're written like scripture, that clipped, formal, slightly archaic register you get in translated religious texts, where the sentences are short and nothing is explained. The big one goes something like this. In the beginning there was a void, and in the void there was an egg, and from the egg came the original one. The original one made two beings, time and space. Then it made three more, who between them made matter and spirit. And having made the world, the original one went into an unyielding sleep. You don't need me to translate. The original one is Arceus. The two beings are Dialga and Palkia. The three are Uxie, Mesprit and Azelf. But notice what the text does. It never names anybody. It calls Arceus the original one, and leaves it there, which means the myth as written could be describing the creation of Sinnoh, or the creation of the entire world, and generations of fans have argued about which. The book won't tell you. Here's the gap that I find properly interesting though. Giratina isn't in it. Giratina is the third member of that set, time, space and antimatter, essentially. It lives in the distortion world, a place where the physics have gone sideways. It's a major legendary with an entire game built around it, and the creation myth doesn't mention it at all. Not as a villain, not as a mistake, not as a fourth sibling who was left out. Its name is simply absent from a document that carefully lists everything else, which reads to me less like an oversight and more like a redaction. Somebody in that world wrote down how everything began and left one name out, and the thing they left out lives in a reversed world underneath reality and is quite cross about it. There's another book up there that I think is the scariest text in the franchise, and it's about the Lake Trio. It reads as a warning. Look not into the Pokemon's eyes, and in an instant you'll have no recollection of who you are. Dare not touch its body, and in 3 days all emotion will drain away. And above all, harm it not, because in 5 days the offender will grow immobile in entirety. Memory, then feeling, then the body, in that order, on a timetable. That's not a legendary Pokémon description. That's a curse, written by somebody who believed it. Now the bit that got changed. There's a set of texts called the Sinnoh folk tales, and the third one has caused more argument than anything else in the library. In the English version, it talks about a time long ago when there was no distinction between humans and Pokémon, that they lived together, ate at the same table, treated each other as the same kind of thing, which is already a lovely, melancholy idea. It reframes the entire relationship as something diminished rather than natural. The Japanese text goes further. In the original, that lack of distinction includes marriage. Humans and Pokémon married each other. That's what it says. The English localization removed it. There's a very thorough side-by-side of the two texts done by Legends of Localization, and the change is clear once you see it laid out. The English version keeps the closeness and drops the specific claim. I understand exactly why that decision was made. I'd probably have made it too, if my job was getting a children's game past a ratings board in 2007. But it does mean that English-speaking fans have spent nearly 20 years arguing about the implications of a passage they've never actually read, and it left a lot of downstream weirdness. There are characters in later games, N in the Unova games most obviously, who get described in ways that brush up against this idea, and the fandom's ability to make sense of them depends heavily on which version of a bookshelf in Canalave they grew up with. Then Legends. Arceus turned up and made the whole thing more complicated rather than less. That game goes back to Sinnoh's distant past, to a version called Hisui before the region was settled properly. And in Hisui, humans and Pokémon do not live together at all. They're frightened of each other. Pokémon are dangerous and people keep their distance, and the entire premise of the game is that catching one is a novel and slightly mad thing to attempt, which is the opposite of what the folktale describes. So there are two ways to read that. The boring way is that a different development team wrote a different game and didn't cross-reference a bookshelf from 2007. The interesting way, and this is the one I've fully committed to personally, is that the folktale is wrong. That it's a myth in the proper sense. Something the people of Sinnoh tell each other about a golden age that never happened, the way every culture does. and I think that's a genuinely brilliant thing for a game to contain. Not lore, but bad lore. Fiction inside the fiction. A world where the in-universe history books are unreliable, and the player has no way of knowing which shelf to trust. Most fantasy worlds hand you a codex and expect you to believe it. Sinnoh hands you a library and quietly declines to vouch for it. One last loose end from that region, because it's been sitting unexplained for the better part of 20 years, and nobody talks about it enough. In Snowpoint City, in the far north, there's a temple. You go down through it, floor by floor, in the cold, and at the bottom, there's a statue. If you're carrying Reggie Rock, Reggie Ice and Reggie Steel, the statue wakes up. It's Reggie Gigas, the king, according to another of those short verses. A body of rock, a body of ice, a body of steel, and when you gather the three together, the king will appear. Those three Pokémon are from Hoenn. They're sealed in ruins on the other side of the world. Nobody has ever explained what their king is doing, asleep in the basement of a temple, in a snowy town, in Sinnoh, or who put it there, or why the instructions for waking it were written down. Which brings us rather neatly to the one region where the ancient history isn't a myth at all. It's documented, it's dated, and you can walk past the graves. There's more on those shelves and a couple of things worth adding about how it all fits together. There's a myth from Veilstone about a young swordsman who treated Pokémon with contempt, used them as tools, discarded them, and it does not end well for him. It's a morality tale with an edge to it, the sort of thing you tell a child to frighten them into behaving. And it's one of the few texts in the library that's clearly written as instruction rather than history. There's another book that only appears under particular conditions. If you've got Arceus and you've been given a particular plate by a hiker in the Orbur mine, a new volume turns up in the library called Sinnoh's Myth. The hiker, it turns out, wrote it. He'll tell you his theory about how Arceus connects to Dialga, Palkia, Giratina, and the Lake Trio, and then admits he's been contributing to the book himself, which I find quietly brilliant. The library isn't a fixed archive. It's got a bloke in it who is actively writing new theology based on rocks he found in a mine, and the game lets you read his work. The distortion world deserves a mention too, since I brought Giratina up and then left it there. It's the reversed place. Gravity does what it likes. Platforms hang in nothing. Waterfalls run sideways. And the whole area is presented without a map, because a map wouldn't mean anything. You go there once in Platinum, and it's still the most visually confident thing these games have ever done. And nothing in the Canalave books prepares you for it, because Giratina isn't in the Canalave books. Cynthia is the other piece of this. She's the champion, and she's also an archaeologist, and her interest in these myths is treated as her actual personality, rather than a hobby. She keeps turning up at ruins. Her grandmother lives out near Celestic Town, and looks after an ancient painting. She's the only champion in the series who seems to have read anything, which makes her the one character in Sinnoh who might notice that a name is missing from the creation story. The games have never had her say so, and a last thought on why the library exists at all. None of it is required. You could complete Sinnoh without going up those stairs. There's no achievement, no item, no acknowledgement anywhere in the game that you've read a word of it. Somebody wrote all of that in a deliberately archaic register, had it translated, had it edited, had it checked, and put it on a shelf on the 3rd floor of an optional building in a port town, on the off chance that a child would climb the stairs out of curiosity. That's an act of faith in an audience, and it's the reason people are still arguing about it 20 years on. Kalos is the pretty one. It's based on France, it's got a city with an Eiffel Tower in it. There's a lot of cake and fashion, and you can change your character's hairstyle. On the surface, it's the least ominous region in the series, and it contains, without any real competition, the darkest thing the mainline games have ever put on screen. The man's name is Azaid. You meet him first as a beggar on Route 13, muttering to himself about a flower Pokémon. And he's enormous, well over twice the height of everybody else. Hunched, filthy, talked about by the other characters. You walk past him. Most people walk past him multiple times before anyone tells them who he is. 3,000 years ago, he was the king of Kalos. He had a Floette. Floette is a small fairy-type thing that carries a flower, and this one was his beloved Pokémon, who accompanied him before the war. So it wasn't a battle partner, it was an inheritance and a friend. Then there was a war, Kalos against another nation, and the games are notably unsentimental about how that worked. Pokémon were conscripted. AZ's Floette was taken from him and sent to fight, whether he wanted it to go or not, because he was the king, and this is what king's Pokémon did. What came back to him was a box. Inside the box was the flower. Not the Pokémon, just the flower it had been holding. And this is the part of the story I think about most, because everything after it is a straight line, drawn by grief. He built a machine to bring her back, and it worked. She came back, alive, exactly as she'd been. There was a side effect. The energy involved was substantial enough that both of them came out immortal. That's why AZ is the size he is, incidentally. The exposure changed him, physically, and left him with a lifespan measured in millennia. He didn't ask for that. It was thrown in. The machine ran on the life force of other Pokémon. That's the cost. To bring one Pokémon back, it took the lives of a great many others. And the game does not leave this abstract or off-screen. The graves of the Pokémon spent to power that machine line Route 10. You walk past them on the way to the next town. They're just there, in a field, and there's no cutscene, and no music sting, and no character stops to explain them. Standing stones in a meadow, and you find out what they are hours later, and then you have to go back and look at them again. Floette found out what had been done to bring her back. She left, and AZ, already immortal, already alone, already the size of a house, did not take that well. He took the machine, the thing he'd built out of love, and he turned it into a weapon. And he fired it. It destroyed both sides. It ended the war by ending everyone in it. That's canon. That's in a Pokémon game. A grieving man built a resurrection machine, powered it with a graveyard's worth of lives, lost the one thing it was for, and then used it to kill everybody. Afterwards he walked away and kept walking, and he did not stop for the next 30 centuries, looking for her. His brother buried the weapon deep underground, so nobody could use it again, which, spoiler for a 13-year-old game, doesn't hold, because Team Flare dig it up. 2,000 years ago, roughly 1,000 years into the wandering, something happened that I think is the most human bit of the whole thing. A powerful man approached him and asked for help protecting Kalos, and AZ, who by that point knew exactly what he was capable of, refused to build another machine that took from others. Instead, he built one that would share the eternal life he'd given Floette, rather than draining it out of anyone. He called it the ultimate weapon and hid it inside Prism Tower, the great glowing thing in the middle of Lumiose City that everybody uses as a landmark. He switched it on to revive her. He did eventually find her, so it sat there dormant beneath Geosenge Town for 3 millennia. There's a theory in the games, Professor Sycamore's, and AZ himself endorsed it when he heard it, that mega evolution exists because of that first blast, that ordinary stones lying around Kalos were irradiated by the weapon's energy and became megastones, which would mean one of the franchise's signature battle mechanics is, in-universe, nuclear fallout with a good marketing team. I don't know that I fully buy it. Sycamore's a bit prone to enthusiasm, but the games let it stand, and it does explain why Kalos specifically is where mega evolution comes from. Now, the bit that's a mystery in the practical code-level sense rather than the narrative one. AZ's Floette, the Eternal Flower one, with the black and red bloom, was in the game. Complete. Fully modelled, fully coded, given her own form, sitting in the data of X and Y, unobtainable, not difficult, not event-locked in a way anyone could satisfy, simply not given out. Then Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire came along, and she was in there too, still unreleased. Sun and Moon, same. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, same again. Roughly a decade of games shipping with a finished Pokémon that nobody was allowed to have, sitting in the files, patiently, like a letter that never got posted. Which, for a creature whose entire story is about waiting an unreasonable length of time to be reunited with someone, is almost too on the nose. I'd assume it was deliberate poetry if I didn't strongly suspect it was actually a distribution event that got planned, scheduled, and then quietly dropped. She was finally made obtainable in Legends ZA, the Kalos game that came out in October 2025. So that particular loose end has, after about 12 years, been tied off. And there's one more thing about Kalos' War that I can't stop turning over. In the Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the post-game bit with Zinnia, which is already the strangest content in that game, she mentions that there's another Hoenn, a parallel one. And the difference between the two, the specific thing she names, is that in the other world, the Kalos War never happened, and the ultimate weapon was never built. That's a Hoenn character in a Hoenn game, casually referencing a war in another region as the hinge that separates two universes, which means the games consider what AZ did to be significant enough to define an entire timeline. Not a regional tragedy, a branch point for reality. And he's still just sitting on Route 13 in the rain, 3,000 years old, asking people if they've seen a flower. Right, since we're in Kalos anyway, and since we've just been very heavy indeed, let's do something lighter, or at least smaller. Lumiose City is absolutely full of things nobody has ever explained, and most of them are quite silly, and one of them is a ghost. A few more pieces of this, because the Kalos story has more connective tissue than it gets credit for. Lysander, the villain of X and Y, the man who digs the weapon back up, is descended from AZ's brother, the same brother who buried it. So in one fan theory, the family that hid the thing eventually produced the man who went looking for it. And Lysander's motive is not what you'd expect from a Pokémon antagonist. He isn't after power or money. He's a man who spent his life trying to help people, ran out of belief that it would ever be enough, and concluded that the world was overcrowded and that the kind thing to do would be to reduce it. He talks about beauty a lot. He's polite about it. He is, in his own account, being merciful. That's a strange thing to be sitting inside a game where you can also buy a hat. The other loose end is Zygarde, which is the one I've never made peace with. There's a third legendary in Kalos, the green serpentine one, that's built into the plot structure without ever getting a plot of its own. It's got forms, it's got a whole cell collecting mechanic that arrived later in Sun and Moon, and it plainly exists to be the centerpiece of a third Kalos game. That game didn't happen. Every previous generation had got one yellow, crystal, emerald, platinum. Kalos didn't, and there's evidence from various leaks and data findings over the years suggesting 2 further Kalos titles were planned and referenced internally before being dropped. So Kalos is the region with the most ambitious story in the series and the least finished one, which is probably why it generates so much of this. The unanswered questions in Kanto are unanswered because nobody thought about them. The unanswered questions in Kalos are unanswered because somebody thought about them a great deal, and then the follow-up got cancelled. As for Azit himself, he does get an ending. After you become champion, he challenges you to a battle at a parade in the streets. And when it's over, he says he finally feels free of the part of himself that built the thing. And she comes down out of the sky and lands in his hands, and he sees her for the first time since the war, which is a nice place for him to end up, all things considered. He doesn't appear again after that, neither does she. The game just lets the pair of them go without a fuss in the middle of a street party while everyone else is busy looking at you. Lumiose City is enormous by the standards of these games. It's a proper city, a wheel of boulevards radiating out from Prism Tower, with cafes and boutiques and 100 buildings you can walk into for absolutely no reason. And because it's so big, and because the developers clearly had fun with it, it's stuffed with small unexplained things. None of them are dramatic. Most of them are the sort of detail you'd never notice unless you're the kind of person who talks to every single NPC 4 times, which, no judgment, is probably a decent chunk of the people listening to this. Let's do them one at a time, gently, and then we'll be done with Kalos. Start with the famous one. There's an office building on North Boulevard. Nothing marks it out. You go in, you get in the lift, you go up to the 2nd floor, and as you step out, the lights flicker. Behind you there's a girl. Dark hair, hex maniac clothing, standing where nobody was standing a second ago. She doesn't walk. That's the detail that gets everyone, and it's a genuinely clever bit of design. Every other character in that game has a walking animation. She's frozen mid-stride and glides like a sticker being dragged across the screen, which is exactly what a badly rendered ghost would look like if you happen to see one. She says, "No, you're not the one." Then she moves off screen and she's gone. You can't follow her, you can't trigger it again, it's once per save file. And there's no reward, no item, no quest log entry, no follow-up. I did this by accident, years ago, at about 1 in the morning, and I made a noise I'm not proud of. The thing that's kept this alive for over a decade is the specific wording. Not "go away," not "leave this place," not any of the standard spooky NPC phrasings. She's looking for someone. She checked, and it isn't you, and she's carried on looking. Kotaku asked Junichi Masuda about her directly, back in 2014, and by all accounts he was cheerfully evasive about it, which tells you either that there's an answer he wasn't giving, or that there isn't one, and he was enjoying himself. Both are entirely plausible. There's one thread of connection, and it's thin. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, up on Mount Pyre, which is Hoenn's graveyard, there's another Hex Maniac who says something quite similar. That one is fully animated and walks about normally, so she's not the same character in any obvious sense, but the echo is deliberate enough that people noticed. Now the message. In one of Lumios's train stations there's a timetable, and on the back of it somebody has written a note. It says, "I'm going to go for help. Wait in the usual place." That's it. No name, no date, no recipient. Written on the back of a public timetable in a train station in a city of tens of thousands of people, which is a very strange place to leave a private message unless the person you're leaving it for knows exactly where to look. There's no follow-up anywhere in the game. Nobody mentions needing help. Nobody mentions waiting anywhere. The popular theory ties it to the girl in the lift, on the reasonable grounds that both are unexplained and both have a slightly desperate quality to them. I'm not convinced they're connected, but I'd like them to be, which is how most of these theories start. Then there's Route 14, which has the scary house on it, and quite a few graves scattered about. 6 of those graves are laid out differently to the rest, 2 neat rows of 3 in an orderly little block outside the house. Everything else in that area is scattered the way graves in a Pokémon game usually are. And elsewhere in Lumiose there's a maid in an office building who talks about the Riches family, who are characters from the Unova games, a wealthy lot, and 6 of the family members are trainers you can battle. She says the family moved after the events of the Unova sequels, except for the father, who stayed behind. 6 trainers, 6 graves in 2 rows of 3. A family that moved and 1 man who didn't. I want to be honest, that's fan arithmetic, not confirmed anything. It could easily be 6 graves that a level designer placed because 6 looked tidier than 5. But it's the kind of coincidence that, once someone points it out to you, you can't stop seeing. Something much gentler now. Outside Kuriwe Town Station, there are 2 Skiddo. Skiddo are the little goat ones. An older woman outside a cafe in Kuriwe will tell you about them, that their trainer abandoned them there, and they've stayed. You can go and look at them. They're rendered in the world, standing outside the station. You can't talk to them, can't battle them, can't catch them. can't help them in any way. They just exist as scenery. That's almost certainly a reference to Hachiko, the Japanese dog who kept going to the station to meet an owner who had died and waited years and got a statue for it. It's a story every Japanese person knows, and Game Freak putting a version of it in a train station is a lovely bit of quiet writing. It's also, functionally, two goats you can't rescue standing in a car park forever, which is a slightly grim thing to leave in a game about befriending animals. While we're at those trains, the ones at Kuriwe don't go anywhere. There's no map, no timetable you can consult, no ticket, no destination. You can't board them. Keolos has functioning rail elsewhere, so it's not that the developers didn't build trains. These specific ones simply sit there being scenery for a route that doesn't exist. 2 more, and then we'll leave. There's a backpacker who turns up in the hotels around Kalos randomly in different ones. If you find him and talk to him across 4 separate days, which nobody was ever going to do by accident, he gives you an item called the Strange Souvenir. It's a small carved wooden head. He mentions offhandedly that he's from a region you haven't heard of. The item does nothing. You can sell it. That's the entire function. 3 years later, Sun and Moon came out and the region was Alola, and the carved head is very obviously an Alolan thing, and the backpacker had been quietly advertising the next generation to anyone patient enough to chase a wandering NPC around a country's hotels for 4 days. Which I think is a genuinely great bit of foreshadowing, undermined slightly by the fact that in Sun and Moon, you can just buy one in a shop. And last, a callback rather than a new thing. That glitch we spent time on earlier, the grey column from Cinnabar, is hidden in Lumiose 2, tucked in a doorway, visible only if you rotate the camera to precisely the right angle. Game Freak have never acknowledged it as anything, and they keep putting it in things. As for the girl in the lift, Legends ZA is scheduled for release in 2025, set primarily inside Lumiose, and she is expected to appear in the pre-release material, potentially in a trailer, and on the official city map. First time she'd been seen in official Pokémon media since 2013. Whether the game itself actually explains who she is, I'd want to check properly rather than tell you something confidently wrong, because Kalos has a long history of people assuming answers are coming and then finding they aren't. Which is fitting, really. A city where somebody left a note on a timetable for a person who may never have read it. 2 more from the hotels, since I've already dragged you round most of them. There's a maid you can find upstairs in one of them, again, randomly placed, again requiring several days of persistence. Talk to her enough and she'll offer you an EV, not any EV. She's very clear that it's special, and that she caught it in Mr. Backlot's trophy garden, which is in Sinnoh, a different region entirely. On the other side of the world, she'll trade it for absolutely anything you're holding, and the EV is, on inspection, unremarkable. It holds a rare candy, which is nice, but its stats are ordinary, and it looks like every other EV, so we're left with a hotel maid in France carrying a Pokémon she caught in the private garden of a wealthy man in another country, insisting it's special, and giving it away to a passing teenager for whatever's in their pocket. There's no follow-up. Nobody explains what she was doing there, or how she got it. Then there's the hiker, who the fandom has nicknamed the con artist, and I'd argue he's the best joke in the game. Same setup. Find him across several days, and he'll eventually offer you a deal. He wants your Gyarados. In exchange, he's offering a Magikarp, which he describes in terms suggesting it's a very special Magikarp indeed. It isn't. It's a Magikarp. He is straightforwardly attempting to swindle a child out of a sea dragon. It's almost certainly a nod to the salesman on the SS. The salesman on the SS, Anne from the first generation, who sells you an overpriced Magikarp and has been a running joke ever since. What nobody's ever addressed is what he does with the Gyarados afterwards. He doesn't appear again. He doesn't battle you with it. He trades his Rhyhorn for your Gyarados. And the last one, which is small, and which I think about more than the ghost, there are doors in the Carlos power plant that are locked and never open. Not locked until you get the key, just locked, modelled, textured, present in the world, closed for the entire game. Somebody on that team built those doors, textured them, placed them, and then either ran out of time to put anything behind them or decided quite deliberately that a locked door is more interesting than a room. I genuinely don't know which, and I've read a fair amount of speculation that doesn't know either. What I'd say is that a city this large is always going to have a few of these, corners where the ambition outran the schedule, and Lumiose has more of them than anywhere else in the series precisely because it was trying harder than anywhere else in the series. On the 22nd of November, 1997, Nintendo held a trade show in Japan called Space World, and on the floor of that show there was a playable demo of Pokémon Gold and Silver. Gold and Silver would not actually come out for another 2 years, so a small number of people, attendees, journalists, whoever wandered past, sat down at a cabinet and played a version of a game that no longer existed by the time the finished thing shipped. Different Pokémon, different starters, a different map. And then the show ended, the cabinets were packed up, and that was that. What survived was scraps, a handful of photographs, some of them taken off a screen at an angle, a bit of VHS footage, magazine coverage in Japanese, and a lot of people's memories which are famously reliable. And out of that, over the following 2 decades, an entire cottage industry of speculation grew. Because people had seen things. There were starter designs in those photos that never appeared in any released game, the ones people ended up calling Kurusu and Honoguma, a little crocodile and a fire bear that weren't Totodile and weren't Cyndaquil. There were creatures glimpsed in the background of footage that nobody could identify. There were rumours about a bigger map, about regions connected differently, about Pokémon that got cut. You have to remember what the information environment was like. This is pre-YouTube for most of it. Fans were trading scanned magazine pages and arguing about 6 blurry pixels. People built reputations in that community on the strength of how carefully they'd studied a videotape. One chap has said publicly that he spent about 15 years going over every scrap of footage trying to reconstruct what was in there. The demo was, for 21 years, the closest thing this hobby had to a lost city. Then on the 26th of May 2018, an anonymous user posted some ROMs online. 4 of them, 2 gold, 2 silver, in debug and non-debug variants. Built on the 15th of November, 1997, a week before the show floor opened. It was real. What was inside was more than anyone had prepared for. Over 1,000 sprites, not a handful of curiosities, a functionally complete alternate version of Generation 2, with a monster roster that only partially overlaps with what we got. The starters that had haunted people for 2 decades were there, confirmed, exactly as the blurry photos suggested. And beyond that, an early Noctowl that looks nothing like the final one, and is, in my honest opinion, better. An early Mantine, a baby Vulpix, a whole scrapped evolution line for Tangela, cut evolutions for Lickitung, for Farfetch'd, an alternate branch for Slowbro. There's something genuinely strange about seeing those. They're not concept art, they're finished sprites, animated, sitting in a game, waiting for a version of 1999 that didn't happen. The work of taking it apart was done collaboratively and quickly by prototype enthusiasts, people from the cutting room floor, from Hidden Palace, from the Pret reverse engineering community, plus assorted skilled friends, around 8 of them. For the short period they worked on it together, they called themselves Team Space World, which is a lovely name for a group of people who assembled, dismantled a myth, published everything, and disbanded. Now the uncomfortable footnote, because I don't think you can tell this story honestly without it. The material is understood to have come out of a breach of Nintendo's own servers, a claim that has support in court documents rather than just being a rumour. Which is why the coverage at the time was so cautious. The owner of Cerubai, one of the oldest and most established Pokémon fan sites in existence, publicly declined to cover the contents on the grounds that it may have been obtained illegally. That was, I think, the right call for a site in that position, and it's also a bit of a shame because what came out of it is genuinely valuable as history. Both those things are true at once, and I don't think there's a tidy way to resolve it. So what's the actual mystery, given that the demo is now fully documented and you can look at every sprite in it at your leisure? It's this: where did those designs go? Because they didn't just vanish, they keep resurfacing in altered form years and sometimes decades later in games made by people who presumably had access to the same internal archives. The clearest example is the starters. Kurusu, the cut water type sea lion, and its evolutions. There's a shape in there, a particular kind of rounded, marine, elegant thing that a lot of people looked at in 2018 and immediately thought of Poplio's line from Sun and Moon, which came out in 2016. 2 years before anybody outside Game Freak had seen the demo. Same with the fire bear. It never became Cyndaquil, but a bear-shaped fire concept turns up later in a different form. Now I want to be careful here, because it's easy to overclaim. Designers reuse their own ideas. Some of these are the same artists working across 20 years, and if you had a good idea in 1997 that didn't fit, it's entirely natural to reach for it again in 2015. It doesn't need a conspiracy, it's just how creative work goes when the same people keep doing the job. But there's something quietly moving about it as a pattern. It means Game Freak have an attic. There's a pile of things that didn't work in the room they were built for, and every few years somebody goes up and brings one down and tries it somewhere else. The demo also settles one small thing I've always liked. A few of the sprites in it were revised and used in yellow, which came out in September 1998 after Space World before Gold and Silver. So bits of the Lost game did ship. They just shipped in the wrong game, quietly, without anyone noticing for 20 years. There's a version of this story where the reveal is a disappointment, where the lost thing turns out to be mundane and everyone goes back to their lives. That's not what happened here. The demo was, if anything, weirder and richer than the rumours. And I think the reason people care so much about it isn't the Pokémon. It's the idea that there was a Generation 2 that was fully imagined and then discarded, and that it survived on a chip in a drawer somewhere for 2 decades while a global fandom argued about photographs of it. The thing genuinely was lost. And then it genuinely was found, which almost never happens. Anyway, that's the mystery from outside the games. Let's finish with the one from inside the newest ones, which is a hole in the ground with something at the bottom of it. A couple more things that came out of the demo, because the sprite roster was only the headline. There's a world map in there, and it isn't the map Gold and Silver shipped with. It's a different arrangement of Johto, different routes, different connections, towns in the wrong places. So the region as we know it was still being rearranged a full year after this build. That map wasn't publicly available at full resolution for a while afterwards, and getting it out into the world was its own small project. There's a shiny sprite set for every one of the original 151, drawn for this build, and in several cases quite different from what shipped. Shinies were being worked out here. They exist in the demo in an early form, without the special animation they'd get later, and 2 Pokémon, Pikachu and Sunflora, are hard-coded to play the sparkle animation whenever you send them out, regardless of whether they're actually shiny, which is either a debugging convenience or somebody on the team having a laugh. There's a Hoot Hoot with a unique fade-in animation when it's sent out, which appears in some pre-release footage and then never again. And there are music cues in there, early arrangements that were then rearranged for the final games, and at least one fanfare that turns up in the Space World footage as the sound you hear when you catch something. Then in February 2019, the story got a postscript. Going back through the same leaked material, people found assets connected to capsule monsters, which is the name the whole franchise went by during its earliest development, years before it was called Pokémon at all. Bits and pieces from the version of this idea that existed before anyone knew it would work. So the archive didn't just contain a lost Generation 2, It went back further than that, to the thing before the thing. The demo itself is now more thoroughly documented than most released games. Every sprite is public, every cut evolution has been catalogued, and it's still somehow the object I find most haunting in this entire hobby, a complete alternative version of something a very large number of people love, that existed on a show floor for a weekend and then went in a drawer for 21 years. One closing thought on the ethics of it. Since I raised it and then walked away, I don't think there's a clean position available here. The material came out in a way that nobody involved in making it consented to, and that matters. It also represents a genuine and irreplaceable piece of history for a medium that is famously terrible at preserving itself. Games get lost constantly. Source code gets thrown out. Hardware rots. Both of those things stay true at the same time, and the fact that the second one is real doesn't cancel the first. What I'd say is that the people who did the actual documentation work, cataloguing, translating, publishing carefully, treated it as preservation rather than as a scoop. And that distinction seems to me worth something. Paldea has a hole in the middle of it. Not a valley, not a canyon, a crater. It sits right in the centre of the map, ringed by cliffs, and for most of Scarlet and Violet you can see it from wherever you are without being able to get into it. The Great Crater of Paldea. There's a history teacher at the school, Rayfort, whose lessons you can attend, and who is by some distance the most useful character in the game. She'll tell you the crater is thought to be about 1 million years old. She will not tell you what made it. Nobody does. Not in the main game, not in the DLC, not anywhere. 1 million-year-old crater the size of a region's midsection, and the historical record is a shrug. The obvious answer is something falling out of the sky, which raises its own set of questions that we'll come back to. What's inside is called Area Zero, and getting down there is the last thing you do. The history goes back further than you'd expect. About 200 years before the games, there was an expedition into the crater led by a naturalist and author called Heath. He came back and wrote a book about what he'd seen. Creatures that didn't correspond to anything known. Some of them monstrous, some of them impossible. Nobody believed him. He was widely discredited. The consensus became that he'd made them up, and research into the crater stopped for a long time. That's a very specific and very human thing to put in a Pokémon game. A man went somewhere, saw something real, wrote it down accurately, and was dismissed as a fantasist for 2 centuries. About 60 years before the games, somebody noticed the terrastyle phenomenon down there, the crystal business that makes Pokémon go all gemstone shaped. At the time, it only worked inside the crater and couldn't be taken out. 10 years before the games, Professor Sada, or Turo, depending on your version, set up the Zero Lab at the bottom. They cracked the problem of making Terrastall work outside the crater with the Terra Orb, got corporate backing off the back of it, and then moved permanently into the lab. Permanently. That's the word the game uses, and it does an enormous amount of work. They had a son, Arven. He was left to bring himself up. His entire character in that game is a teenager with a sick Pokémon and an absent parent, and a lot of unspoken resentment about it, and it is by a distance the most emotionally competent writing in the modern series. So you go down. 4 research stations on the way, each one with notebooks in it, and the tone of the notebook shifts as you descend in a way I found genuinely uncomfortable. It starts as science and it ends as something closer to devotion. And at the bottom, the reveal. The professor is dead. Has been for some time. The thing that's been talking to you is an artificial intelligence, a copy the professor made of themselves. And there's a lovely fragment of backstory about where the idea came from, involving an encounter with a child who suggested it, which the game gives you and then never expands on. The AI tells you the truth about the machine. There's a time machine at the bottom of the lab, powered by Terrastall energy, and it's been pulling creatures out of the deep past or the far future and depositing them in the crater. Those are the Paradox Pokémon. Heath saw them 200 years ago, before the machine existed, which the game notes and then declines to fully explain. And the machine is still running, with nobody supervising it, which means the crater is slowly filling with animals that don't belong in this era, and some of them have started getting out. So the AI asks you to help shut it down, and then warns you, calmly, in advance, that its programming will force it to attack you when you try. Which it does. It tells you it's going to do it, apologizes in advance, and then does it anyway, because it can't not. And after you win, a thing called the Paradise Protection Protocol takes over. It locks every Pokeball not registered to the Professor's ID, which means you and your 3 friends who came down there with you are standing at the bottom of a crater with no Pokemon you can use, and something very large is coming. I won't spoil how that resolves. It's the best sequence in the game, and it deserves to be played. What I want to talk about is what's left over, because there's rather a lot. No bodies were recovered. The Professor died protecting the legendary Pokemon down there, and nothing was ever found. Their child was never told what happened in any real detail. The AI is gone by the end, so the only entity that knew the whole story is switched off. The crater, still unexplained. If something fell out of the sky 1,000,000 years ago and left a hole that size, then the terrestrial phenomenon, the crystals, the energy, the whole mechanic that the entire game is built around, is quite possibly not from this planet, which produces a question I've never seen the games go near. Terrestrial energy works on every Pokemon, not some, all of them, across every region, from every era, past and future, ancient and mechanical, perfectly compatible with the biology of an entire world. If it came from somewhere else, why does it fit so well? There are only really 2 answers, and they're both quite big. Either it isn't extraterrestrial, and there's a mundane explanation the games haven't bothered with, or it is, and it fits because the life on this planet has something to do with it, in which case a children's game has quietly implied that everything down there came from the same place the crystals did. Game Freak have said nothing. The DLC went to other places and did other things. Terra Pagos, the creature sleeping in the deepest part of the crater, got a story of its own that doesn't touch any of this. And then there's Heath's sketch. The artist on that 200-year-old expedition drew a creature they'd imagined based on things they'd seen, combining features into something that didn't exist. Depending on your version, it resembles the legendary beasts of Johto or the Swords of Justice, which is where this section quietly reaches back and shakes hands with the tower in a Krutik, as we touched on earlier. Somebody in Paldea drew that, and the games have never once put those 2 facts in the same room and commented, I don't think there's a hidden answer waiting. I think the honest reading is that different teams wrote different things and the connective tissue is coincidence and vibes, but that's true of nearly everything we've talked about tonight, and it hasn't stopped any of it from being worth 30 years of argument. A hole in the ground nobody can date the cause of. A man who told the truth and was called a liar. A parent who chose the work. A machine still running with nobody watching it. That's the newest one. It's already better than most of the old ones. A few last threads, because this one has more dangling than anything else on the list. Arven's story is the part I'd point anyone towards. He's got a Mabostiff that's dying, and the entire reason he's dragging you around Paldea hunting enormous Titan Pokémon is that he's chasing ingredients for something that might save it. He is not doing academic research. He's a teenager trying to fix an animal, and his parent, the person who could actually help, is at the bottom of a hole they chose over him. And the game lets you piece together, slowly, that he already knows they're not coming back. He just hasn't said it out loud. The other big open question is what the Paradox Pokémon actually are. The obvious reading is that they're time travelers, genuine creatures from the deep past or the far future, pulled here by a machine. That's what the AI says, and it's the straightforward interpretation. But there's a persistent alternative that the games flirt with and never confirm, that the machine doesn't retrieve, it constructs. That what comes out is built from the descriptions in Heath's book, which would mean the creatures are being generated from a 200-year-old naturalist's illustrations, and the reason they resemble what he drew is that they are what he drew. That would explain the sketch problem rather neatly. It would also mean the man who was called a liar for describing impossible animals eventually caused them to exist, which is a genuinely good bit of science fiction to find in a game with a picnic mechanic. And then there's Cyclizar, which is a perfectly ordinary Pokémon you can catch in the wild, and which looks unmistakably like a smaller, tamer version of the two legendaries. Not a paradox form, just a normal animal that appears to sit between them. The games have never said whether Koraidon and Miraidon are ancient and future versions of Cyclizar, or whether Cyclizar is descended from them, or whether the resemblance means nothing at all. Fans have argued it exhaustively. There's no answer. The DLC went elsewhere. It gave Terrapagos its own story. The creature sleeping at the very bottom of the crater, connected to the crystals. And that story is about the creature, rather than about where any of it came from. The crater has now been dated to over 1 million years old. The energy is still unexplained. The bodies were never found. I suspect that's permanent. And I suspect it's on purpose, because a game that answered all of that would have to become a different kind of game. That's 12. And if you've been awake for all of it, which I sincerely hope you haven't, you might have noticed that hardly any of them are spooky. I thought they would be when I started pulling this together. They aren't, really. What they've got in common is something else. It's that a company making a game about collecting small friendly monsters kept deciding over and over, across 3 decades and 9 generations, not to explain itself. A truck that does nothing, on a dock you can't reach. A girl in a lift who checked and moved on. A flower sitting finished in the code for a decade, with nobody allowed to have it. 3 Pokémon who died in a fire and came back as something else, and no one wrote down what they'd been. None of that is an accident of scope. You don't put a note on the back of a timetable by accident. Somebody typed that. Somebody decided the message would have no sender, and then went to lunch. I don't especially want these solved. I thought I did. I've spent a fair chunk of my life reading arguments about the skull and the war, and whether a hole in Paldea came from space. But sitting with all of them at once, what I've mostly come away with is that the unfinished ones are the ones I've kept. The stuff that got explained is fine. It's nice to know Mew was 300 spare bytes and a bit of cheek. It's nice that the truck never actually got a real answer. But the ones I'll still be turning over next year are the ones where somebody built something, left it in, and never came back for it. Anyway, that's me done. And if you're the person who's meant to be waiting in the usual place, she's still looking. If you want more of this sort of thing, there's plenty left over. I didn't touch Hun properly, and Hun has an entire subplot about a woman from another timeline and a meteor. I've got very little on Unova, which has a character whose origins the developers have made deliberately ambiguous and then declined to clarify for 15 years. All of that's a video for another night. Thanks for spending the last couple of hours with me. Whether you made it to the end or drifted off somewhere around the burnt tower, it's much appreciated either way. Good night.